Lonely widow helps a hungry child, never realizing he was the king in disguise. Such was the simple act of kindness that would forever change Eleanor Wright's life, though she couldn't have known it on that bitter December morning when frost etched delicate patterns across her windows, like memories she couldn't quite grasp anymore. Eleanor pulled her faded cardigan tighter around her thin shoulders, her breath visible in the chill of her small cottage. The radiator had been temperamental for weeks now, but the thought of calling someone to fix it, of having to speak, to explain, to endure pitying glances at the photographs she still couldn't bring herself to put away, was too much to bear. 15 months since Richard's passing, and still the silence in the house pressed against her eardrums like cotton wool. Outside, snowflakes began their gentle descent, each one catching the weak winter sunlight before disappearing against the frozen ground. Eleanor watched them fall, remembering how Richard had always loved the first snow of the season. He would drag her outside no matter the hour, just to feel the flakes melt against their upturned faces. "It's like the sky is blessing us, Ellie," he would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners. A clean slate. There were no clean slates anymore. Only days that blurred together, marked by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, Richard's pride and joy, the antique timepiece he had restored with his own hands. Now it served only to remind her of hours spent alone. With a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest, Eleanor moved away from the window and into the kitchen. The cottage that had once felt cozy now seemed to swallow her whole, its corners filled with shadows where laughter used to be. Her morning routine never varied. Kettle on, 1 tea bag, not 2, as before. Toast she rarely finished. The doctor had mentioned something about her weight at her last checkup, but Eleanor couldn't summon the energy to care. The village of Whitebrook had been their home for 43 years. They had moved there as newlyweds, Richard taking over the local bookshop, while Eleanor taught at the primary school until retirement 5 years ago. Now she barely ventured beyond her garden gate, unable to face the concerned glances of neighbors who didn't know what to say anymore. A sharp knock at the door startled her so badly that she dropped her teacup, watching helplessly as it shattered against the tile floor. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at the broken pieces. Richard's mother's china, the set they'd used only for special occasions until Richard had insisted that "every day with you is special, Ellie." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Eleanor brushed crumbs from her skirt and moved to the door, wondering who would brave the snow to visit her. Perhaps Mrs. Pembroke from next door, with another casserole that would sit untouched in the refrigerator until Eleanor threw it away, guilt gnawing at her insides. But when she pulled open the heavy oak door, there was no well-meaning neighbor on her doorstep. Instead, a small figure stood huddled against the wind, snowflakes caught in dark eyelashes and clinging to a coat that seemed far too thin for the weather. A boy, no more than 10 years old, with intelligent eyes that reminded Eleanor of the children she used to teach. His cheeks were flushed with cold, his hands bare and red-tipped. Something about the way he held himself, straight-backed despite the visible trembling of his small frame, gave Eleanor pause. "I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am," the boy said, his voice surprisingly clear and well-spoken. "I seem to have lost my way." Eleanor blinked, momentarily taken aback by the formality of his speech. "Lost your way? Where are your parents?" A shadow crossed the boy's face, so quickly Eleanor might have imagined it. "They're not here at the moment. I was traveling with my uncle, but we became separated in the storm last night." Only then did Eleanor notice the darkening sky behind him, the snow falling more heavily now. Something stirred within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. Concern. "You've been outside all night? In this weather?" The teacher in her resurfaced, assessing the situation quickly. "Come in at once before you catch your death." The boy hesitated, and in that moment, Eleanor saw something beyond his years in his eyes, a wariness, a calculation. Then his shoulders slumped slightly, and he stepped across her threshold. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly, standing awkwardly in her hallway, careful not to drip melting snow onto her floor. "Take off that wet coat," Eleanor instructed, her voice finding a firmness she had thought long forgotten. "And those shoes as well. I'll find you something warm to wear while they dry." As she turned to head upstairs, she caught sight of the boy's face, a fleeting expression of surprise, quickly masked. Had no one shown him basic kindness before? The thought troubled her as she rummaged through the spare bedroom, eventually finding a sweater of Richard's she had been unable to part with. It would be enormous on the child, but it would keep him warm. When she returned downstairs, she found the boy standing exactly where she had left him, though he had removed his coat and shoes as instructed. He was even thinner than she had initially thought, his wrists protruding from the sleeves of his shirt. "Here," she said, holding out the sweater. "Put this on. It's an old sweater. It will be too big, but it's warm." The boy took it carefully as if it were made of glass. "Thank you," he murmured, slipping it over his head. Richard's navy blue cable knit engulfed him, the sleeves hanging well past his fingertips, but the boy didn't seem to mind. Instead, he ran his fingers over the wool with something akin to reverence. "When did you last eat?" Eleanor asked, noticing the way he swallowed repeatedly, his eyes darting toward the kitchen. A flash of embarrassment crossed his face. "Yesterday morning, I think." Something cracked open inside Eleanor's chest, a hairline fracture in the wall she had built around herself. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the kitchen table. "I'll make you something." As she moved around the kitchen with more purpose than she had felt in months, Eleanor found herself wondering about the strange child sitting at her table. He wasn't like the local children, with their casual manners and constant chatter. This boy sat with perfect posture, his hands folded in his lap, watching her with those two old eyes. "What's your name?" she asked, setting a pan on the stove. "Theo," he replied after the briefest hesitation. "My name is Theo. I'm Mrs. Wright. Eleanor Wright." She cracked eggs into the pan, the familiar motion somehow comforting. "Where are you from, Theo?" "Not from Whitebrook, I assume." "No, ma'am. I'm from quite far away." He glanced toward the window, where the snow was now falling in thick, heavy flakes. "A place called Aldovia." Eleanor frowned slightly as she stirred the eggs. "Aldovia? I don't believe I've heard of it. It's a small country, near Switzerland." Theo's fingers fidgeted with the hem of the oversized sweater. "Not many people know of it." She set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him, along with a glass of milk. "Well, Theo from Aldovia, eat up. We'll need to contact your uncle once the storm passes." The boy picked up his fork with surprising delicacy, taking small, measured bites despite the hunger that must have been gnawing at him. Eleanor found herself watching him, struck by the oddity of having another presence in her home after so many months of isolation. "This is very good," Theo said politely between bites. "Thank you." "It's just eggs," Eleanor replied, but she felt a small, unexpected glow of pleasure at the simple compliment. As Theo ate, the wind outside picked up, howling around the eaves of the cottage. Eleanor moved to the window, peering out at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The road was barely visible now, buried under a blanket of white. "I'm afraid you may be stuck here for a while," she said, turning back to the boy. "The storm's getting worse." Theo set down his fork, something like relief flashing across his features before being carefully concealed. "I hope I'm not imposing." "Nonsense," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I couldn't very well send you back out into that, could I?" For the first time, a genuine smile lit up the boy's face, transforming him from solemn to childlike in an instant. "No, I suppose not." As the day progressed, the storm outside intensified. Eleanor found herself moving around the cottage with more energy than she had in months, building a fire in the hearth that had remained cold since Richard's passing, unearthing blankets from the linen closet, even heating milk for hot chocolate, Richard's special recipe that she hadn't been able to make for herself. Theo accepted her attentions with a mix of gratitude and something that looked almost like bewilderment. He insisted on helping, folding blankets with precise corners and asking polite questions about the photographs on the mantelpiece. "Is that your husband?" he asked, pointing to a silver-framed photo of Richard, taken on their last anniversary trip to the Lake District. Eleanor's breath caught. No one had asked her directly about Richard in months. They all knew, all tiptoed around the subject as if his name might shatter her. "Yes," she said simply. "That's Richard." Theo studied the photograph. "He has kind eyes." The unexpected observation brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. Yes, he did. "My father had kind eyes too," Theo said quietly, still looking at Richard's photograph, though not many people got to see that side of him. There was something in his tone, a heaviness, a grief that resonated with Eleanor. "Is your father?" "He died 3 months ago." Theo's voice was steady, but his small fingers tightened around the edge of Richard's sweater. "That's why I'm with my uncle now." Eleanor's heart twisted. "I'm sorry, Theo. I truly am." The boy nodded once, his jaw tight. Everyone says it gets easier. Does it? The directness of the question took Eleanor by surprise. No one had asked her that either. They all just assured her that time would heal, without ever asking if it actually had. I don't know if easier is the right word, she said slowly, sinking into Richard's armchair. Different, perhaps. The pain changes shape. Some days it's sharper than others. Theo came to stand beside the chair, his eyes serious. My uncle says I shouldn't talk about it, that I must be strong. Your uncle is wrong, Eleanor said firmly. Strength isn't about not talking. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit how much it hurts. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the world had disappeared behind a curtain of white, insulating the cottage in silence. Would you tell me about him? Theo asked hesitantly. Your husband? Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into the protective shell of her grief. But something about the boy's earnest expression, the shared understanding of loss in his eyes, made her nod slowly. Richard was a bookseller, she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. He could find the perfect book for anyone who walked into his shop, even if they didn't know what they were looking for themselves. As the evening deepened, Eleanor found herself telling Theo stories she hadn't shared with anyone, about Richard's terrible singing voice that hadn't stopped him from serenading her on every anniversary, about his collection of mismatched teacups because he couldn't bear to see any left behind in charity shops, about the way he had planted daffodils all along their garden path because they were her favorite. To her surprise, Theo listened intently, asking questions that showed he was truly absorbing her words. When she finally fell silent, he said softly, "He sounds like someone who made the world better just by being in it." The simple truth of it brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "That's exactly what he did." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, startling them both. Eleanor wiped her eyes and stood up. "Goodness, look at the time. You must be exhausted after your ordeal." Theo nodded, though he seemed reluctant for their conversation to end. "Where should I've made up the spare room for you," Eleanor said, leading him upstairs. "The bathroom is just across the hall. There's a new toothbrush in the cabinet, still in its packaging." The spare room had been Richard's study once, but Eleanor had converted it months ago, unable to bear seeing his empty desk. Now, with fresh sheets on the bed and the small lamp casting a warm glow, it looked almost welcoming. Theo stood in the doorway, his eyes wide. "This is all for me?" Something about his surprise made Eleanor wonder again about this strange, formal child and the circumstances that had brought him to her door. "Of course," she said gently. "Is there anything else you need?" The boy shook his head, then hesitated. Would it be all right if I borrowed a book? I usually read before sleeping." Eleanor smiled, a real smile that felt foreign on her face after so many months. Richard would approve. "There are plenty on the shelves downstairs. Choose whatever catches your eye." After Theo had selected a book, an old copy of The Secret Garden, that had been one of Richard's favorites, and bid her a polite good night, Eleanor found herself standing in the middle of her living room, slightly bewildered by the turn her day had taken. The cottage felt different somehow, still filled with memories, but no longer quite so oppressive. As she moved around, turning off lights and banking the fire, she realized that for the first time in 15 months, she had spent an entire day without counting the hours until she could reasonably go to bed. That night, Eleanor slept without the aid of the pills her doctor had prescribed, lulled by the rhythm of the storm and the knowledge that, for tonight at least, she wasn't alone. Morning broke with unexpected clarity, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Sunlight glinted blindingly off the pristine snow that blanketed the village, transforming Whitebrook into a postcard-perfect winter scene. Eleanor woke earlier than usual, a sense of purpose guiding her movements as she dressed and made her way downstairs. To her surprise, she found Theo already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with The Secret Garden open before him. "Good morning," she said, feeling strangely shy. "Did you sleep well?" Theo looked up, his face brightening. "Very well, thank you. The bed was most comfortable. I thought we might have a proper breakfast," Eleanor said, moving to the refrigerator. "I haven't had much appetite lately, but I find I'm quite hungry this morning." Together they prepared a breakfast that would have made Richard proud. Eggs and bacon, toast with Eleanor's homemade blackberry jam from last summer, a pot of strong tea. As they worked side by side, Eleanor found herself noticing details about Theo she had missed yesterday. The precise way he folded the napkins, the careful attention he paid to setting the table correctly, the almost unconscious straightening of his spine whenever he caught himself relaxing too much. "Your uncle must be very worried about you," Eleanor said as they sat down to eat. "Perhaps we should try to contact him now that the storm has passed." A flicker of something. Alarm? Reluctance? Crossed Theo's face. "Yes, I suppose we should, though he might still be searching in the wrong direction. We were separated quite some distance from here." "What exactly were you doing out in such weather?" Eleanor asked, the teacher in her unable to resist probing the inconsistencies in his story. Theo focused intently on cutting his bacon into perfectly even pieces. "We were traveling to London for business. My uncle thought we could save time by taking a shortcut through the countryside." "In a snowstorm?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "He can be determined." Theo's voice held a note of careful neutrality. "The snow wasn't so bad when we started out." Eleanor studied him over the rim of her teacup. There was more to the story, she was certain of it. But the boy didn't appear frightened or abused, merely reticent. Perhaps his uncle was simply strict, as some guardians could be. "Well," she said finally, "we should still try to reach him. Does he have a mobile phone?" Theo nodded slowly. "Yes, but I don't know the number by heart. It's programmed into my phone, which..." He patted his pockets with a frown. "I must have lost it during the storm." Eleanor sighed. This was becoming more complicated than she had anticipated. "What's your uncle's name?" "Perhaps we could contact the authorities. Let them know you're safe." A flash of panic crossed Theo's face. "No! He composed himself with visible effort. "That won't be necessary. My uncle will find me. He always does." There was something in his tone, a resignation almost, that troubled Eleanor. She set down her fork. "Theo, is everything all right?" "With your uncle, I mean." The boy's eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. "He's doing his best. Since my father died, things have been difficult. For everyone." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding more than Theo might have realized. The first months after Richard's death had been a blur of paperwork and decisions she hadn't been prepared to make. If Theo's father had been someone of importance in this Aldovia place, his death might have created even more complications. "Well," she said finally, "you're welcome to stay here until we can contact him. I wouldn't feel right sending you off on your own." Relief softened Theo's features. "Thank you, Mrs. Wright. I promise I won't be a burden." "Eleanor," she corrected him gently. "You can call me Eleanor. And you're not a burden, Theo." After breakfast, Eleanor found herself facing a dilemma. She had planned to walk into the village to speak with the local police about Theo's situation, but the snow was deeper than she had anticipated, the path still largely uncleared. And there was the matter of leaving Theo alone, something she was increasingly reluctant to do, though she couldn't have explained why. In the end, it was Theo who suggested a solution. "Perhaps we could clear your path together. I noticed you have shovels in the garden shed. Then we could both go into the village." Eleanor hesitated. She hadn't ventured beyond her garden in weeks, preferring to have groceries delivered rather than face the well-meaning but painful conversations with neighbors. But the thought of staying confined indoors on such a brilliant day suddenly seemed unbearable. "All right," she agreed. "Let's clear the path." Working together in the crystal-clear winter morning, Eleanor felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Theo tackled the snow clearing with the same focused determination he seemed to bring to everything, insisting on taking the heavier sections despite his small size. Occasionally, when he thought she wasn't looking, Eleanor caught glimpses of a more carefree child, his face tipped up to catch snowflakes on his tongue, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he patted a section of snow into a more perfect shape. "Did you and your father ever build snowmen?" she asked, pausing to catch her breath. Theo's movement stilled. "No," he said quietly. "There wasn't time for that sort of thing." "No time for snowmen?" Eleanor couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Every child should build at least one snowman." The boy shrugged, his eyes downcast. "There were always lessons or official... my father was very busy." "Official what?" Eleanor wondered, but she didn't press. Instead, she set down her shovel and bent to scoop up a handful of snow. "Well, there's time now." Theo watched, bewildered, as Eleanor began to roll a snowball along the ground, picking up more snow until it grew to the size of a large pumpkin. "What are you doing?" "Starting a snowman," she replied, straightening up with a smile that felt foreign but welcome on her face. "Are you going to help, or are you going to stand there looking scandalized?" For a moment, Theo seemed torn between his instinct for decorum and the simple childish desire to play. Then, with a quick glance up and down the deserted lane, he set down his shovel and bent to gather snow. What began as a simple snowman evolved into an elaborate snow sculpture as Theo revealed an unexpected artistic talent, carefully crafting facial features and even a crown of icicles. Eleanor found herself laughing, actually laughing as they worked, the sound startling in the quiet winter air. "Richard and I used to have snowball fights," she confessed, smoothing snow over the figure's shoulders. "Right here in this garden. The neighbors thought we were mad, two grown adults pelting each other with snow." Theo looked up, his cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. "You miss him very much, don't you?" The directness of the question might have pained her just yesterday, but today Eleanor found she could answer honestly. Every minute of every day, but it helps somehow to talk about him. To remember the joy, not just the loss. Theo nodded solemnly. "My mother says that too, about my father." "Your mother is a wise woman," Eleanor said, patting the snow figure's head. "Is she still in Aldovia?" "Yes." Something in Theo's voice changed, became more guarded. She had to stay behind. To manage things. Before Eleanor could inquire further, a voice called out from the lane. "Mrs. Wright? Is that you?" Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Pembroke from next door, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, looking at her with undisguised astonishment. It occurred to Eleanor how this must appear, the reclusive widow out in her garden, building a snowman with an unknown child. "Good morning, Mrs. Pembroke," Eleanor called back, suddenly self-conscious of her snow-covered clothes and flushed cheeks. The older woman picked her way carefully along the partially cleared path. "I haven't seen you outside in ages, dear." "And who's this young man?" Eleanor glanced at Theo, who had immediately straightened his posture and adopted a polite, somewhat distant expression. "This is Theo. He's staying with me for a few days." Mrs. Pembroke's eyebrows rose almost to her hairline. "Is he indeed? A relative?" "No, just a visitor who needed shelter from the storm," Eleanor replied, feeling strangely protective of Theo's privacy. "We were just about to head into the village, actually." "Well, you'll have a time of it. The main road's barely been plowed." "Mrs. Pembroke said, her curious gaze still fixed on Theo. "Pleasure to meet you, young man." "The pleasure is mine, ma'am." Theo responded with a small bow that made Mrs. Pembroke blink in surprise. After a few more minutes of conversation, during which Eleanor deflected several increasingly direct questions about Theo's origins, they bid Mrs. Pembroke goodbye and returned to the cottage to warm up before attempting the walk to the village. "I'm sorry about that," Eleanor said as she hung their snow-dampened coats by the fire. "Mrs. Pembroke means well, but she's rather inquisitive?" Theo suggested, a hint of a smile playing around his lips. Eleanor laughed. "That's a polite way of putting it. She'll have told half the village about you by lunchtime." As she prepared hot chocolate to warm them up, Eleanor found herself watching Theo as he explored the living room, examining the bookshelves with interest. There was something so familiar about his mannerisms, though she couldn't place why. "Did you really teach children?" Theo asked suddenly, turning from the bookshelf where he had been examining a row of children's classics. "For 35 years, Eleanor confirmed, carrying 2 steaming mugs into the room. "At the primary school here in Whitebrook." "What was it like?" Theo accepted the hot chocolate with a polite "thank you," but his eyes were alight with genuine curiosity. Eleanor settled into her armchair, considering the question. "Challenging. Rewarding. Exhausting and exhilarating, often in the same hour." She smiled at memories that had been overshadowed by grief for too long. "Every child is different, you see. They all learn in their own ways, have their own strengths." "Did you have a favorite?" Theo asked, blowing carefully on his hot chocolate. "Teachers aren't supposed to have favorites." Eleanor replied automatically, then laughed at herself. "But of course we do, though we try not to show it. I always had a soft spot for the quiet ones, the observers, the ones who thought deeply before they spoke. Like me?" There was a vulnerability in Theo's question that tugged at Eleanor's heart. "Very much like you," she agreed softly. They set out for the village after finishing their hot chocolate, bundled in layers against the cold. The main road was indeed poorly cleared, but they picked their way carefully along the edges where the snow was shallower. Eleanor had forgotten how beautiful Whitebrook could be in winter. The stone cottages with their snow-laden roofs, smoke curling from chimneys into the clear blue sky, the village green transformed into a pristine white field where children were already building snow forts and engaging in spirited snowball fights. She felt Theo tense beside her as they approached the playing children, his gaze both wistful and wary. "Have you never played in snow before?" she asked quietly. "Not like that," Theo admitted, watching as a laughing girl tackled her brother into a snowdrift. "It looks chaotic." "That's rather the point," Eleanor said with a smile. "Would you like to join them?" Theo shook his head quickly. "No, thank you. I'm happy walking with you." The village police station was a small brick building at the far end of the high street. As they approached, Eleanor felt Theo's steps slow, his hand unconsciously gripping the sleeve of her coat. "We don't have to do this if you don't want to," she said, stopping to look down at him. "But your uncle must be worried sick. And if something's wrong, Theo, if you're in any kind of trouble, the police can help." Theo bit his lip, conflict clear on his face. "It's not that simple," he said finally. "My uncle isn't... He's not a bad person, but he doesn't understand me. And since my father died, he's been so focused on duties and responsibilities and protocols that he's forgotten I'm still a child." The earnestness in his voice struck Eleanor deeply. How many of her former pupils had faced similar situations, adults who expected them to be miniature grown-ups, who forgot the importance of play and wonder. "Tell you what," she said, making a sudden decision. "Let's postpone the police visit. Just for today. Instead, why don't we do something fun?" The hope that brightened Theo's face confirmed she had made the right choice. "What did you have in mind?" Eleanor glanced down the high street to where Richard's bookshop still stood, now run by his former assistant. She hadn't set foot in it since the funeral. "How about we visit a very special bookshop? And then maybe the cafe for hot chocolate and cake?" Theo's smile was answer enough. The bell above the door of Wright's Books jingled as they entered, the sound sending a cascade of memories through Eleanor. The shop looked much as it always had, shelves climbing to the ceiling, comfortable armchairs tucked into corners, the scent of paper and binding glue and the faint trace of the pipe tobacco Richard had favored. "Mrs. Wright!" Peter, Richard's assistant turned proprietor, nearly dropped the stack of books he was carrying. "This is... What a wonderful surprise." Eleanor managed a smile, though her throat had tightened painfully. "Hello, Peter. The shop looks wonderful. I've tried to keep it just as Mr. Wright would have wanted," Peter said, setting down the books and coming forward to greet them. His eyes landed on Theo with undisguised curiosity. "And who might this be?" "This is Theo," Eleanor said simply. "He's staying with me for a little while. Theo, this is Peter Thompson. He and my husband worked together for many years." Theo extended his hand with that same formal air that seemed so at odds with his age. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thompson. You have a beautiful bookshop." Peter's eyebrows rose as he shook the boy's hand. "Thank you, young man. Feel free to explore, and if you need any recommendations, that's what I'm here for." As Theo wandered toward the children's section, Peter leaned closer to Eleanor. "I can't tell you how good it is to see you, Mrs. Wright. We've all been worried." Eleanor nodded, unable to form words around the lump in her throat. Coming here had been both harder and easier than she had imagined. Richard's presence seemed to echo from every corner, but instead of the sharp pain she had expected, there was a kind of bittersweet comfort in being surrounded by the things he had loved. "Who is he really?" Peter asked quietly, nodding toward Theo, who was now carefully examining a leather-bound collection of fairy tales. "I've never seen him in the village before." "A visitor," Eleanor replied, unwilling to share Theo's complicated story. "He needed somewhere to stay, and I needed the company, I think." Peter's expression softened. "Well, he's welcome here any time. As are you, Mrs. Wright, always." Eleanor spent the next hour rediscovering the bookshop through Theo's eyes. The boy moved through the stacks with reverence, his fingers trailing lightly over spines, pausing occasionally to read a passage from a book that caught his interest. His selections were eclectic and sophisticated, poetry, mythology, history, but Eleanor noticed that he lingered longest in the travel section, poring over photographs of distant places with undisguised longing. "See somewhere you'd like to visit?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. Theo quickly closed the atlas he had been studying. "Just looking," he said too casually. "My tutor says it's important to understand world geography." "Your tutor?" Eleanor frowned slightly. "You don't go to regular school?" A flash of alarm crossed Theo's face. "I meant my teacher." "At school?" Eleanor didn't press, though the slip intrigued her. Instead, she helped him select several books to borrow. Peter insisted they take them as gifts before they made their way to the village cafe for the promised hot chocolate and cake. The cafe was warm and bustling, filled with villagers taking refuge from the cold. Heads turned as they entered, curious glances and whispered conversations following them as Eleanor led Theo to a small table by the window. She had expected to feel uncomfortable under the scrutiny, but found she didn't much care what people thought. There was something liberating in that realization. "Everyone's staring," Theo murmured, hunching his shoulders slightly. "Small villages," Eleanor explained, picking up the menu. "Not much happens in Whitebrook." A reclusive widow appearing with a mysterious child is practically headline news. To her delight, Theo grinned at that, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his serious face. "Should we give them something to really talk about? I could pretend to turn into a frog." Eleanor laughed, the sound drawing even more curious glances. "Better not, Mrs. Pembroke might have a heart attack." Their hot chocolates arrived topped with whipped cream and chocolate shavings, accompanied by slices of Victoria sponge cake that made Theo's eyes widen appreciatively. As they ate, Eleanor found herself talking more freely than she had in months, telling Theo stories about the village and its inhabitants, about her years teaching, about the life she and Richard had built together. In return, Theo shared carefully edited anecdotes about his own life, his love of astronomy, his skill at chess, his mother's beautiful singing voice. He spoke of Aldovia in vague terms, describing mountains and forests but few specific details. Whenever Eleanor asked direct questions about his home or family, he would deflect with a skill that would have been impressive in an adult, let alone a child. As they were finishing their cake, the cafe door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive overcoat. Eleanor wouldn't have paid him much attention except that Theo suddenly went rigid in his seat, his fork clattering against his plate. "Theo?" Eleanor asked, concerned by his sudden pallor. "What's wrong?" The boy didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the newcomer, who was speaking urgently with the cafe owner. There was no mistaking the fear in Theo's eyes, though he was clearly trying to master it. "Is that your uncle?" Eleanor asked quietly, glancing at the stranger. Theo shook his head minutely. "No. But he works for him. His name is Dominic. He's been looking for me." A cold feeling settled in Eleanor's stomach. "Theo, what's going on? Are you in some kind of danger?" Before Theo could answer, the man turned, his gaze sweeping the cafe until it landed on their table. His expression shifted from tense concentration to unmistakable relief. "Your Highness," he said, striding toward them. "Thank God." Eleanor blinked, certain she had misheard. But Theo's shoulders slumped in resignation as the man reached their table and bowed, his head. "We've been searching everywhere for you, Your Highness," the man continued, his accent crisp and European. "The entire security detail has been mobilized. Your uncle is beside himself with worry." Eleanor looked between the man and Theo, bewilderment giving way to a dawning realization. "Your Highness?" she repeated faintly. Theo, if that was even his name, met her eyes with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I should have told you the truth." He turned to the man. "Dominic, this is Mrs. Eleanor Wright. She saved my life during the storm and has shown me great kindness, Mrs. Right, this is Dominic Haupt, my security coordinator." Dominic inclined his head toward Eleanor. "The royal family is in your debt, Mrs. Right. If you hadn't taken His Highness in, royal family?" Eleanor echoed, the pieces finally clicking into place. The formal speech, the precise manners, the careful evasions. "You're not just from Aldovia. You're Prince Theodore Alexei Philip of Aldovia." Theodore confirmed quietly. "Second in line to the throne after my uncle since my father's death." The cafe had gone utterly silent, every eye fixed on their table. Eleanor felt as though she had stumbled into some bizarre dream. "You're a prince," she said numbly. "An actual prince." A ghost of a smile touched Theodore's lips. "I did try to tell you I was lost." Dominic cleared his throat. "Your Highness, we need to depart immediately. Your uncle is waiting at the hotel in Oxford, and there are matters of state that require attention." Theodore's face fell, the brief lightness vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Of course," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone Eleanor now recognized as his royal manner. "I'll just collect my things from Mrs. Wright's home." "I'm afraid there isn't time, Your Highness," Dominic said apologetically. "I've already dispatched agents to retrieve your belongings. The car is waiting." Eleanor watched as Theodore seemed to physically transform before her eyes, his posture becoming more rigid, his expression carefully neutral. The playful boy who had helped her build a snowman was disappearing behind a royal mask. "May I at least have a moment to say goodbye properly?" Theodore asked, a note of steel entering his voice despite his youth. Dominic hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Your Highness. I'll wait by the door." As the security coordinator moved away, Eleanor found her voice again. "A prince," she repeated, still struggling to reconcile the revelation with the child she had come to know. "All this time you were a king in disguise." "Not a king yet," Theodore corrected her gently. "And hopefully not for a very long time." "But yes, I was in disguise in a way." He looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry I lied to you." "Why did you run away?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low despite the straining ears around them. "What happened?" Theodore sighed, suddenly looking every bit the child he was. "After my father died, everything changed. The king died. Long live the king, that's what they say. My uncle became regent until I come of age, and overnight I went from being Prince Theodore to being the heir presumptive. Everyone started treating me differently. More lessons, more protocol, more security." His voice dropped even lower. "No one asked how I felt about my father dying. No one seemed to remember I'm still just a boy who lost his dad." Eleanor's heart ached for him. "So you ran away?" "I just wanted a break," Theodore admitted. "Just a day or two where I could breathe, where I could be sad if I wanted to be sad, or angry if I wanted to be angry. Where I could build a snowman without someone telling me it wasn't dignified." He met her eyes directly. "I never expected to find someone who understood." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "Grief doesn't care if you're a prince or a pauper, Theodore. It finds us all. You helped me remember him," Theodore said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father. The good parts, not just the crown and the duty. Thank you for that." Dominic cleared his throat from across the room, tapping his watch meaningfully. Theodore nodded, then turned back to Eleanor. "I have to go," he said regretfully. "But I want you to know that these 2 days have meant more to me than I can say." Eleanor found herself blinking back tears. "They've meant a great deal to me too, Your Highness." Theodore smiled, a small, sad smile. "I liked it better when you called me Theo." As they stood to leave, the cafe patrons hastily pretended they hadn't been eavesdropping, though several phones were surreptitiously taking photos. Eleanor ignored them, focusing solely on the boy, the prince, who had inadvertently brought her back to life. Outside, a sleek black car with diplomatic plates waited, 2 stern-looking men in dark suits standing beside it. Dominic opened the rear door, waiting expectantly. Theodore turned to Eleanor one last time. "Goodbye, Eleanor Wright. Thank you for showing me what kindness truly looks like." "Goodbye, Theo," Eleanor replied, no longer caring about protocol. "Don't forget to build snowmen, even if they aren't dignified." The prince's face lit up with that unguarded smile once more. Then, to the visible shock of his security detail, he stepped forward and hugged Eleanor tightly. She returned the embrace, feeling the tremor in his small frame. "Remember what I told you," she whispered. "Strength isn't about not talking. It's about admitting how much it hurts." Theodore nodded against her shoulder, then stepped back, composing himself with visible effort. With a final wave, he climbed into the car, which pulled away smoothly, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the snow-covered village street. The cafe door opened behind her, curious villagers spilling out to watch the departing royal entourage. Eleanor heard the excited whispers, the questions, but she couldn't bring herself to answer them. Instead, she began the walk home, her mind whirling with everything that had happened. Her cottage seemed impossibly quiet when she returned. The fire burned down to embers. The books Theodore, had selected still stacked neatly on the coffee table. Eleanor moved through the rooms, touching the chair where he had sat, the mug he had used, trying to process the extraordinary turn her life had taken. In the spare room, she found his borrowed clothes folded with military precision on the bed, Richard's sweater placed carefully on top. Beside them lay a note, written in an elegant hand far too mature for a 10-year-old. "Dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means they have found me, as I knew they eventually would. I want you to know that I never intended to deceive you, at least not about anything that truly mattered. These 2 days have been the most normal, and therefore the most extraordinary, of my life. You treated me not as a prince, but as a child who needed kindness. You showed me that it's possible to honor those we've lost while still finding joy in small things, like building snowmen or drinking hot chocolate or telling stories by the fire. My mother used to tell me that true nobility isn't about titles or crowns, but about how we treat others. especially those who can offer us nothing in return. You have taught me the truth of her words. I don't know if our paths will cross again, but please know that you have made a difference in my life that will endure long after these words fade. With deepest gratitude, Theodore. P.S. I borrowed The Secret Garden from your shelf. I hope you don't mind. I needed something to remember this by. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, the note trembling in her hands as tears blurred her vision. The extraordinary truth of what had happened, that she, Eleanor Wright, had unknowingly sheltered a prince, seemed almost secondary to the impact Theodore had made on her life in just 2 short days. For 15 months she had existed in a fog of grief, shutting out the world, shutting out life itself. It had taken a lost child, a royal child in disguise, to remind her that kindness wasn't just something she gave to others. It was something she needed to show herself as well. The following weeks brought changes to Eleanor's quiet life. News of Prince Theodore's adventure spread rapidly, and for a brief time, Whitebrook found itself the subject of international attention. Journalists appeared at Eleanor's door, seeking interviews she politely but firmly declined. Curious tourists wandered the village streets, hoping to glimpse the cottage where a prince had taken shelter. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her privacy, accepting with good grace the sudden celebrity that had been thrust upon her, but refusing to capitalize on it. When a royal aide appeared with an official invitation to visit Aldovia as a guest of the royal family, she surprised herself by accepting. The journey to Aldovia, a small but prosperous alpine nation she had barely heard of before meeting Theodore, marked her first trip abroad since Richard's death. As the plane descended over snow-capped mountains and picturesque valleys, Eleanor felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. What would it be like to see Theodore in his real life, surrounded by the pomp and circumstance of royalty? The answer came sooner than expected. As Eleanor was escorted from the airport by a royal chauffeur, the car unexpectedly diverted from the main road, turning onto a tree-lined avenue that led to a small, elegant hunting lodge rather than the palace she had anticipated. "There's been a change of plans, ma'am," the chauffeur explained. "His Highness thought you might prefer a more informal welcome." Before Eleanor could respond, the car had pulled up before the lodge, and there on the steps stood Theodore, not in royal regalia, but in a simple sweater and jeans, his face alight with undisguised pleasure. "Eleanor," he called, abandoning protocol entirely as he ran to meet the car. "You came." And as Eleanor stepped out into the crisp Aldovian air, she was enveloped in the enthusiastic embrace of a boy who happened to be a prince, but who had reminded her, more importantly, what it meant to be truly alive. 3 years later, on the anniversary of Richard's death, Eleanor stood in her garden, watching as daffodils swayed in the gentle spring breeze. The cottage was bright with sunlight, windows open to the fresh air, photographs of Richard displayed prominently rather than hidden away. On the mantelpiece, alongside those beloved photographs, stood newer additions. A formal portrait of Prince Theodore in his royal regalia, inscribed with warm personal thanks. A photograph of Eleanor at Theodore's 13th birthday celebration, where she had been an honored guest. A handcrafted wooden box containing letters exchanged regularly between an English widow and an Aldovian prince. The garden gate creaked, and Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Pembroke approaching with a cake tin in hand. "Just thought I'd bring over some of my lemon drizzle," the older woman called. "I know it's a difficult day for you." "Thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by the gesture. Where once she had avoided such interactions, she now welcomed them. "Would you like to come in for tea?" "I was just about to put the kettle on." As they settled in the kitchen, Mrs. Pembroke glanced at the calendar on the wall, where the coming weekend was circled in red. "Is that when the boy, His Highness, is visiting again?" Eleanor smiled, pouring hot water into the teapot. "Yes, he has a 4-day break from his studies. We're planning to visit Richard's bookshop. Theo has quite the reading list prepared." The royal visits had become a regular occurrence, sanctioned by Theodore's uncle after witnessing the positive effect Eleanor's friendship had on the young heir. Twice a year, Prince Theodore would arrive in Whitebrook with minimal security, staying in Eleanor's spare room and enjoying the simple pleasures of village life that had so enchanted him during his first inadvertent visit. "It's still remarkable," Mrs. Pembroke said, shaking her head. "A real prince right here in your cottage. And to think you never even knew who he was." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where the daffodils Richard had planted continued to bloom year after year. "I think perhaps I did know, in the ways that truly mattered," she said softly. "Not that he was a prince, but that he was a child who needed what I needed, someone who understood loss, who could share grief without trying to fix it." She thought of the lonely widow she had been, trapped in her sorrow, and the hungry child who had appeared on her doorstep in the midst of a snowstorm. Neither of them could have imagined how that chance encounter would transform their lives. "Sometimes," Eleanor said, pouring the tea, "the most extraordinary connections come disguised as the simplest acts of kindness." And as afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the cottage that no longer felt empty, Eleanor Wright raised her teacup in a silent toast to Richard, to Theodore, and to the healing power of an open heart.